get that started. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is workshop 3, Backward Design Part 2, Intercultural Assessment Tools. So we're going to go ahead and get into this and do the housekeeping part first. Expectations, thank you all for those who were able to join early. I actually wasn't able to join too early, but the earlier we join, the earlier we can get started. Again, if you'd like to rename your video, just hover over your name and right-click on it if you have a PC, of course, and rename should be one of the options. I'm going to actually try to rename mine if it'll let me, because I always have to give that extra typing in with the cursor. Because for some reason it selects something else each time. Anyway, okay, did work. So if you want to do that, you're invited to do that. We do want to have everybody's videos on, unless we're doing the fishbowl, which we're going to do after activity again. But of course, I always want to acknowledge there are circumstances where we do need to have them off. Workshop's going to be about 90 minutes. And of course, unless you're taking a turn to speak, your microphone should be off so we're not having feedback loops and background noise and all that other stuff. So those are our expectations. Next part is invitations and permissions. So nothing has changed here. Invitation to be hear and be heard. Brave space. You are invited to speak to one another, not just to me. But also remember that the chat is an option. So if you are not feeling comfortable about verbalizing whatever it is you want to say, you can of course pop it in the chat. I'll try to do as good a job as I can monitoring that. And you have that function within the Zoom chat of broadcasting out a message to everyone, or you can select someone from the drop-down list and send someone a private message as well. If you want to respond to something they said, but you want it to be private, that's fine too. Invitation not to freeze yourself or others. So again, these are challenging conversations. And I recommend to everyone that our impressions of people, what we think of them, should be a collection of experiences rather than one specific experience. We need to be able to let some of those things go when we're maybe put off by something somebody said, but likewise do the same for yourself. You might put your foot in your mouth. That's perfectly fine. And of course, this goes with the next one, permission to say it ugly, or as we've learned, say it in draft. I really like that expression. I think I need to put that in the slide. It's maybe a little more eloquent than say it ugly, but say it ugly is kind of gets right to the heart of it. And as always, permission to mess up technology. If there's one thing I can say about messing up technology, I've at least been consistent. I'm consistently every workshop, something messes up for me. So there is that. And then as always, if anybody would like to add anything, whether if you want to say it now or put it in the chat or shoot it to me in an email some other time, I'm happy to add anything that you all think might make these workshops run more smoothly and be more effective. We can add those in as well. Okay. Our learning outcomes for today, we're of course going to be working on our empathy and self-awareness in our intercultural activity, and through that getting the experience with running this kind of an activity. So thinking about how we might facilitate that. And then we're going to start looking at different assessment tools. So considering different uses and approaches to assessing or assessment tools. Then we're going to explore elements of assessment tools that we should be considering when we're going through the selection process of, is this a tool that I want to use or not? So we're going to look at the various elements to be considered when looking at different assessment tools. And then finally, we'll focus on some ways to recognize different types of data that are provided by assessment tools. So I'll have some examples and we can talk about those probably briefly, just because we like having our intercultural activity conversation takes up the bulk of our time. So we'll see how much time we have for some of this stuff toward the end. But I at least want to introduce these concepts here. Oops. Our agenda, we're going to do activity 5. I'm not sure why it says activity 5. This is activity 3. Not sure why that happened. Looking at types and approaches of assessments, assessment criteria, so those elements of assessment, and different data samples. And then we're also going to talk about using a rubric for assessment when we look at qualitative data. And then we'll have a wrap-up discussion at the end, or at least some time for some wrap-up. So let's get into the intercultural activity. This is the hot buttons activity. So if you have that worksheet handy, and if not, go ahead and pull that out, whether it's digitally or in paper. This activity is focusing on the skill of empathy, and under the knowledge category, cultural self-awareness. So again, self-awareness, I think we're fairly familiar with. Remember that each of these elements basically has two components to it, each of these competencies. Self-awareness can be a little bit more complex, but empathy certainly has two parts. Self-awareness, the ability to articulate those insights into your own cultural rules and biases. Then there's kind of further breakdown of seeking complexity, awareness of how your experiences shape the rules, how to recognize and respond to your own cultural biases, but also other people's biases, and this ability to shift your perspective in self-description. So not only how you see yourself and better understand yourself, that's certainly a big part of this, but also recognizing that there are complex ways that other people perceive you as well. So that kind of comes into the mix. With empathy, there's two main parts to empathy. The first one is the ability to recognize and kind of access different perspectives, not just your own worldview, but other worldviews. So being able to incorporate both of those and then using those perspectives to act in a supportive manner. So that's the kind of the empathetic part, but the intercultural part is specifically not only viewing a person's circumstance or position or how you're interacting with them from your own worldview, but also being able to access their worldview and maybe another worldview, and using all of that information to act in a supportive manner. That is, that here it says recognizing, but also being sensitive to their feelings and expectations. So hopefully that's a lot of ground we're going to try and cover in this one activity, but I think we did pretty well yesterday. I feel pretty confident in this group today's ability to cover some of this in the discussion. So I'm going to send you out into breakout rooms here in a moment, and you're going to have about 10 minutes. And you can either do a screen capture of these questions or pull them up from the Brightspace module. And I will also, if I can get them real fast, I'm going to post them up in the chat here, just if anybody wants to do a copy and paste out of the chat. Of course, I've got a million windows in the way. Here we go. Narrowing in on this. I'm going to broadcast this in the chat. So if you want to copy and paste it out of the chat, it's up there for you as well. Because, of course, when we go in the breakout rooms, the chat will disappear. And, of course, you won't have access to the slide anymore. Let's see. There are 13 of you. I think I'm going to do, we'll do four breakout rooms. And you should see that pop up here in a minute. So I want you can share your hot buttons with sharing the worksheet first, and even talk about some of the follow-up questions that come with that. But I want you to also spend some time answering these two questions from a specific experience that you had. Why did you feel this way? Why was it a hot button for you? And then also thinking about how your behaviors or reactions might be irritating to others. It's also helpful to maybe think about, it asks you to think about a specific moment, but you might think about those moments where you've been traveling abroad, or if you've led students abroad before, that might be a source of some of these moments that you might look to. But try to answer these questions. And of course, as always, please also try to identify someone to be in the fishbowl before you get too far along in this discussion. Maybe do that first. Select your victim or volunteer. And then as the other thing I always like to remind everyone in these discussions, only share what you are comfortable sharing. Don't feel obligated to share more than that. We want to respect everyone's privacy, and some issues might be difficult to talk about. And so I want to acknowledge that as well and remind everyone of that in particular. So I'm going to do one more breakout room since we've had a couple more people join. Okay, so hot buttons. These two questions about a specific moment, and I'll call you back. It's 1:13 on my computer. I'll call you back at 1:23. the recording here. So welcome back from the too short breakout room. So maybe I need to consider giving you all a little more time with that. So hopefully you've selected some victims, volunteers for the fishbowl, and everyone else can turn off their video. And we're gonna have this conversation around our two main questions, but also a couple of other things. So again, as we normally do when we're coming out of our breakout rooms and doing the fishbowl, a couple of reminders. Number one, let's try to avoid speaking for other people. Certainly you might want to share some of the things that were discussed, but try to stay focused on your perspective and how those things kind of hit you, maybe your reaction or something. But we're going to start out, actually, I'm going to ask each of you to maybe share one of your hot buttons, maybe from this moment, and we can get into these two questions about why did you feel this way, and then thinking also about your own behaviors. So would anybody like to start off with a hot button moment and why you felt that way? Yeah, Carolina.
Yes. So I think it was very interesting that we discussed like some topics, and we talked about, for example, someone being too like close to you and kind of like invading your personal space and being touchy. And we agreed that it really depends on like who you are and who is the other person. If you're like familiar, if it's a man, if it's a woman, etc. So it's like very gender based. This perception, if this can be disruptive or not. We mentioned speaking too quietly for some folks like me, that we're Latino, so speaking too quietly can be very annoying, because it's like just say like what you want to say, instead of just being like, so you don't get the information. So this could be a little bit for us, because we're used to a more like loud conversations. And also something that I thought was very interesting is the not making eye contact, like how we prefer, but we can adapt if someone doesn't make eye contact. It's our preferred way to, or mine, to communicate. But if a student or a peer doesn't do it, it's all right. Then we can just like notice and then be empathetic. I would say towards this situation. So I think that was it. It's just like we can be adapt situations into situations very frequently. So it really depends.
Thank you, Carolina. I'm curious, would you mind sharing which of those was your hot button? Was it the quiet talking, or you had multiple?
I had multiple, but quietly talking. It's very, I think like recent, I was in a situation in which someone was always speaking too quietly, and that really annoyed me. And so I think that would be my hot button.
So this is where I want to pull that thread. So you were annoyed by the quiet talking. Why do you think that is? Why do you think you feel annoyed when people do that?
I don't know. Maybe I felt like this person maybe wanted me to like just say something again and like be more present, because I was not understanding. I could not understand a thing. So then I had to be more present and more aware, closer to the person, to the situation. So yeah, I feel like it was kind of like trying to catch my attention, to get my attention more. Maybe I felt this way.
Interesting. Yeah,
be over interpreting as well. But
so the extra effort you had to put into that was maybe like, okay, yeah, okay, interesting. Okay, thank you very much, Carolina. That's helpful.
Thank you.
Who else would like to go?
And kind of share for our group. It was interesting. In our group, we were a little all over the place. Everybody kind of had some different hot buttons, like with the speaking too loudly, too quietly. Like one person, the loudness didn't bother them at all. And for the other, the quietness didn't bother them. And for me, both of them bother me. So we were a little all over kind of on all of them. But the two where we seemed to, everyone kind of agreed was more towards the bottom, like with acting cold, distant, superior to everyone, boasting or self-promoting more than the situation calls for. We all kind of agreed that those were hot buttons for us. And I think for me, my personal one would be the boasting more than the situation calls for. But yeah, I like how the activity, though, I will say it really set up, it was very situational in that, you know, it's, you're tired, there's a lack of sleep, and that, you know, it's in this moment and there's more than one person doing it. So I think that really kind of narrowed it down for me, because you could always argue, you know, well, if it was this situation, I would, if it was, I wouldn't. So I like that this activity did that. But yeah, like with the making eye contact too much or not enough, and understanding that it's probably a cultural context too. I think someone mentioned, you know, if making eye contact is, you know, not very culturally appropriate, you know, having that understanding. But yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. And I appreciate you pointing out that the context also matters. Like some of these hot button issues may be more of a hot button under certain circumstances. And there may be times when you're much better equipped to just let it go and not be bothered by something. So that's important to consider. The people who are maybe a little overly boastful, what is it about that bugs you or is a hot button for you?
Well, again, I think if I'm in a situation where I'm tired and there's more than one person doing it, to me, it just seems unnecessary. It's unnecessary. Like, we get it, we know it, you don't have to say it. And yeah, it just seems extra that we don't need to the situation. But then again, even saying that, you know, if I started breaking it apart, then it could be like, oh, well, maybe they're just really excited because they've accomplished this and they're super proud of themselves, or they're super proud of their kid for doing something, like, you know, then I could start to see it. But just an initial reaction, no, I don't want to hear about it. I'm tired. Like, great for you, but I'm done here. That would just be my response.
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. That was good. Who'd like to go next?
Okay.
Scott?
It's interesting, Rachel, you're talking about how your group is like, your different views, and ours did as well. Our group was interesting. One of the things that came up was punctuality, and how some of us were very serious about, like, being on time and not being late to something is very important. And while others were like, well, that's not like actually being on time is not even ideal. It's much more normal for me to be very late, to be a little bit late to something, and then getting irritated with people when that isn't normal. And I was one of those people of when we first came to America, I hadn't realized that many people in the Midwest are very punctual. And when they say 6 o'clock, they might mean 6 o'clock or even 5 minutes earlier than that. And in Australia, if you said, oh, you were having a barbecue at 6 o'clock, you'd turn up at 6:30, 7 o'clock. And that would be perfectly fine. If you came at 6 o'clock, the host might be like, well, something's happened to you for you to be early. Did I get it wrong? And then when we fell right into that trap when we first came to America, go to the Thanksgiving party, of like, they said, oh yes, we're going to have Thanksgiving at 6, and we were like, okay. And we turned up at 6:30 and people were waiting, and I'm like, oh no, it's like being late for Christmas lunch, really late, and the turkey's ruined, and like, I had no idea. And so we quickly learned. But then it was funny because there were people in our group that were like, yeah, but if you like, that was very different. And it all came down to our own families, our own family traditions, and our backgrounds that meant with how we felt about that, which was interesting. And so other irritations that we had, a lot of them, like mine, I guess, personally, thinking back to what irritates me, would come down to like my upbringing as to whether or not I was taught that that was a bad thing to do, like that's an irritating thing. Another story I had of going to Japan, when I went to Japan in high school, I noticed everybody sniffing and slurping food. And for me, that was so offensive when I was just like, I just can't believe that they would be doing this. And then I was writing that down, and then I thought, why did I feel like that? And I'm like, my parents were very strict about those things, like not messing around eating food, and blow your nose if it's running, and things like that. So I don't know. It came back to families. Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you, Scott, for bringing that in. This is part of that self-awareness, right? Where do these things come from? Where do they originate from? And that also kind of goes to that, why do I feel this way? Well, I've been beat over the head with it as a child. Like, this is important. Whether or not it's, those kind of table manners, or, if you don't show up early, you're late, or, something like that. So, yeah. I often like to tell people that are kind of struggling with those things that they're given from their families, from their parents. I say, the thing about families is they're really good at pushing your buttons, because they're the ones who installed them. So they know where they are. So who'd like to go next?
I can do that. So our group, we spend the time, after we introduced ourselves, like only me was the one who shared this worksheet. So that's why I became the visible. Anyway, so thinking of an interest at the first questions. Well, I stick to the your worksheets that try to imagine the imagination, the hypothesis that we are very stressed. Then I start to check my hot button under the assumptions that we are under very much stressed situation. So actually it is not something that is closely related to our culture, but in general, I think regardless of culture or people, I would be very annoyed if someone take too much time on explaining things that even the dumbest person in the world can understand. Or very similarly, there is one case that talking about taking a long time to get to the point of a conversation. I think these two things, they are kind of on the same page, where we are very stressed situation, where the time is very precious. If a person in front of me taking too much time to explaining something which could be very simple, that would be very annoyed to me. Maybe it's human nature related, not very cultural specific. And also another thing that relates to me, that my behavior could be trigger other person's hot button, would be I can think of a situation that some cultural, because of the cultural like history, or their cultural thing, because of the cultural situation, they ask people to try their food. I'm not vegan. I do not have any allergies to any food, but there are some kinds of food that I really do not enjoy myself. And then, of course, I can try, but maybe they can read from my face that I have some kind of afraid to try the new thing. So that kind of thing could be trigger their hot button, emotional hot button. That and then our time ended, and we couldn't share much more from there.
Thank you, Nora. That's a really great example. My wife is one of those people that, like, she's all for new experiences. She loves to travel and everything, but she has a thing where she does not eat seafood, fish, crustaceans, even seaweed. She will not eat it. And that's kind of been a point of contention sometimes when we have hosts who are like, "Oh, I made this. Would you like to try some?" And she's like, "No." Full stop. And that can be irritating in that situation, because you don't want to cause offense of, someone spent a lot of time and effort in making something, but it's not a, meant to be seen as insulting. It's just, that's her thing that she
Right.
knows she does not like that. And so, yeah, there are some of those things that are individual to us that people may not understand right away and misinterpret about us, right? That we
Right.
respond this way, and they think it's for a number of different reasons. So that's a really great example of that. Thank you. Okay, Carolina.
In my group, the exercise was like a self-awareness exercise. And while we were sharing, we talked about like all of us were irritated by all of the things that happened on the list. So we were like talking that we might be very irritable people, However, the other thing is that my behavior, my Carolina behavior, I behave like that all the time. So I'm like, okay, I'm annoyed by this, but I'm super annoying to other people at the same time, actually. And I try to be very aware of that. But I think that is the important point, like to be aware, and try to adapt, like the other Carolina was saying. I think that Colombians, I don't know if all Latin Americans or people from Medellin, my city, we tend to adapt to the situation according to what is happening in the environment. And it has happened to me here in the US. I try to adapt to some things. And now when I go back to Colombia, we are always late to everything, but now when I go back and people are late, if we're going to meet, I'm like super annoyed, because that is one thing that I've adapted here in the US, right? To be on time. So I'm trying to balance, this new behaviors here and my old behaviors that are like rooted in my subconscious. And it's a mess, it's a mess, because then I come back here and I'm a mess here, and then I go back and I'm a mess there. So yeah, I'm trying to adapt at every moment. And we also discussed about how it's so hard to understand traditions and cultural behaviors of other people, right? Even if they try to explain it to you in their own cultural mindset or worldview, and if you don't align to that, not in a positive or negative way, but if you don't understand why people is always annoyed because you're late, or it's hard to actually introduce that into your own behavior if you don't understand it, right? And to understand that, you have to go through a lot of deconstruction, individual deconstruction. That takes time. So yeah, when I was reading this, and I was like, oh, I'm super annoying for a lot of people. And one example for me was when I met my advisor here at Purdue. The first day I came to the campus, I stormed into her office without knocking or anything. The door was open. In Colombia, if the door is open, you can go in. So I went in and I hugged her immediately, and she almost died. Like, I felt that she was going to have a heart attack. And at that moment, I felt bad. I'm like, oh my God, I did something that I shouldn't have done. However, the next day, I stop at the door and wait for her to give me the cue, come in. So I came in and she stood up and she waited for me to hug her, but I didn't hug her because, the day before was so awkward. So this is like super awkward because we were like standing in front of each other, not doing anything. But now she waits for my hug, and she tried and I tried. So that is the adaptation. Like, okay, when you give me the cue, I will hug you. But I still miss that, and I'm not gonna lose the hugging thing, the touching thing of the Latin Americans.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Carolyn. That's a really great example of how transitioning from the self-awareness part to the empathy part, you're making those adjustments. Oh, you learned, okay, maybe that's not the way they do things here. Let me try to adjust my behavior and accommodate their expectations. So that's the empathy part, accessing that other perspective. And to this point about whether it's being late or soft talkers or whatever the case may be, I found a lot of times, especially with our students, that if we can have a conversation about those things that we don't understand, why would someone do that? Why would someone show up late to a meeting and at the very least, they're not apologizing for being late. They're not getting right down to business. They're actually like socializing. Why are they doing this? But when I have a conversation with my students, that a lot of times when there's discrepancies around timeliness, we have this very American Western perspective of being on time, being punctual, getting started right away. We have all of these cultural sayings around that, like time is money, right? And so from our perspective, it is the value of respect coming through, of respecting other people's time, I don't want to waste your time. I want to get down to business and get started on time for that reason. But when I explain to students that this other perspective, what we call polychronic time perception, the emphasis is not on work or getting things done. And people absolutely from these cultures do respect other people's time, but they respect it in a different way, because from their perspective, relationship is the more important part. We have to make sure we're okay with one another first, and then we can get down to business. And so timeliness is viewed as, well, the meeting starts when everybody's here and everyone's ready to start. That's when the meeting starts. So any expectations about the clock telling us when the meeting starts, that's just more of a general suggestion of when to be in the same space. But the meeting truly starts when we're all there and we're ready to go. And part of that involves checking in. How's your family? How are you? You were sick last week. Are you feeling better? We got to establish that relationship first, and then we can move. So when I explain that to students, then it's like, oh, that's why they do that. It's not because they disregard or the value of my time. It's that they value me as an individual and as a person, and want to have a relationship with me first. And so that recognition about those different perspectives allow us to be, recognize they're not insulting us, right? It's just a different way of looking at these things. So really great example for that. I do want to go on to, I want to point out some other unintended outcomes from this activity. So we talked about self-awareness. So being aware of how other people's behaviors impact us in negative ways or how they irritate us, but also the empathy of recognizing how our own behaviors may irritate other people and being able to adjust that to that or accommodate that difference. But also part of this activity is emotional resilience. So when we're developing emotional resilience, part of that is identifying problems before they come up, and then strategizing ways to deal with those problems if and when they appear. So that's part of what emotional resilience is. So some of you may have figured this out already. This activity typically, and I think it was originally designed specifically for people who were leading groups of students abroad. And in those scenarios, some of you may do this, where you assign students to a room together when you're staying in multiple hotels as you're traveling. You might have them assigned into small groups or pairs sharing a room. And this worksheet was created to, fill this out and then meet with your roommates and discuss your hot buttons and come up with strategies to avoid them or strategies to deal with them when they do come up. And that's a way of both working on self-awareness and empathy, but also this emotional resilience of you're going to be confronted with things under a high stress situation, traveling abroad. How are you going to deal with these things? And it's best to discuss it before they come up rather than waiting until you're annoyed and you're not in a position to deal with it in a good way. So at this point, what I'd like to do, and I'm going to share my screen again, as I talked about this last time, I want to give everyone as much as I'm able to, so probably not every single person, but we'll start in this fishbowl. I would like everyone to have an opportunity to use this TIAGI debriefing method. So we'll start with a couple volunteers, and we don't have to do all 6. In fact, I think probably 3 is sufficient to get kind of some conversation started. So I'll take volunteers of who wants to pick one of these questions, and you lead the conversation about the hot buttons activity, starting with one of these. So would anybody like to practice? And so I've got one up already where I've got kind of a follow-up to this. So the what if, and my what if question is, if you were using this activity, could it be used either to increase individual empathy among students or focus more on group harmony? So thinking about all of the students you're taking abroad and you want to foster that group harmony while they're abroad. What's your take on that? How would you want to use it? What would be the thing you would focus on? Or what do you think this activity is maybe better for? Is it the individual empathy or group harmony? What do you think?
I think it depends.
Sorry.
Sorry, Rachel.
Sorry, Carolina.
Yeah, Rachel, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it could be both. Because I feel like for me personally, like my individual empathy, like as I start talking through my example, I'm like, gosh, Rachel, that really sounds harsh. Like, you need to remember like other people and, you know, my perception of the situation and the way that I'm perceiving their behavior, their actions may not be the way that they are intending for it to come out. So I think for me, it kind of is that self-realization. Again, just by saying it aloud and talking through it, then it's like, oh gosh, wow, that really comes out harsh. But I think too, it can also build with your group harmony, because it was nice in the group of 3 that we had. Again, for a lot of these, we all had very different answers and we all had very different, you know, kind of rationale and explanation behind it. So it was really good to hear, you know, not only their response, but then also the rationale, the reasoning and the justification behind it. So then I think that can potentially build more of a group because there's more of an understanding of your group mates, and can even help bond a little bit when you're out traveling abroad.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. Carolina?
Yeah, I was going to say also that it could be both. And if you are aware of your own behaviors and how those behaviors could impact others, it's going to be easier for you to try to, for example, with my students, to talk about that with your students, right? Like, okay, giving like personal examples on why I feel that way or this way, and how they can like see themselves with any annoying behavior and how that behavior could impact others, right? So that is why it could be an individual one. And group harmony, it's I think it's related more to rules. Maybe you can manage and control better your group if you actually know that this is something that everybody needs to pay attention to, right? So they are going to be self-aware and they're going to know, okay, if something like this happens, I know that maybe I'm disrupting the group harmony. So
Yeah. Thank you both for that one. Scott?
I've got a question about the use of this in a study abroad group setting. So if your group is very homogenous in cultural background and they're in a very different environment, and you do an activity like this, could it just lead to the class going, yeah, I really can't stand all of these things that we've just been exposed to, and that's because they're very different to us, rather than moving beyond that sort of thought of like a notice, like just, you know, very polarizing opinion, especially if you've got a very homogenous group. That's something I had thought of as we were talking about this. And like that example you gave of having this as something that you do in a room at the end of the day, like with a roommate. What if they both have the same annoyance? How will they move beyond just going, that they are very annoying? That really annoyed me. And thinking I didn't annoy anyone today, but they really annoyed me.
Right. Well, it certainly is always a challenge and a risk with doing an activity like this. One of the specific uses that I've seen past leaders do is, so they give the worksheet, they have the students fill it out, and then just as we did, either breakout rooms, or if you're doing it in person, assigning the students who are in an assigned group, so as roommates or whatever, part of this assignment, once you fill out the worksheet, is you must sit down with your assigned roommates and talk through all of this. And you have to come up with strategies for how are you going to communicate that your hot button is being pushed? How are you going to come up with ways to avoid pushing other people's buttons, being aware of what they are and how you can avoid those behaviors that might trigger them, but also dealing with it when it comes up. How are we going to de-escalate the problem? But to your issue about if we're maybe being annoyed or triggered by the surrounding culture, and how do we avoid getting polarized and just saying, oh, that's something I don't like and that's it, is that follow-up debrief with everyone is talking through, why do these things annoy us? What is it about, that question, why did we feel this way about this hot button? Where does it come from? Is it something our parents instilled in us? Is it something about a particular value? So I do want to, let me just go back for a minute because I have some notes in here so a lot of times what comes up are things like rudeness, and those are perception. That is a cultural perception, right? What is polite and what is rude? Those are cultural perceptions and defined by each cultural group. So when students say, well, I don't like this thing because it's rude. Okay, let's talk about that. Why is it rude? And let's recognize that that's a cultural perspective. Politeness and rudeness is purely cultural. Politeness and rudeness does not exist outside of culture. There's no objective rudeness or politeness. We've already talked about issues of directness and indirectness. And of course, that can also be seen as rude or impolite. Inefficiency. And we've already talked about lack of timeliness, things that are annoying or odd behaviors. And then my all-time favorite when I've been traveling abroad, dealing with bureaucracy and hierarchy. That can also be a trigger. But each one of these, and the reason I wanted to go back and bring them up was each one of these, we can have a conversation and kind of peel the onion and pull apart, and why are these things viewed the way they are by us? And as we begin to understand them more, it's kind of like that example I gave with understanding people who come from a polychronic culture that views time in a much more relationship perspective than a task relationship. So, or on a task basis. Through that kind of talking things through and gaining a better understanding of why things are the way they are in that particular culture, hopefully we can avoid some of that polarization. Part of that is practicing suspending judgment and being much more objective in the way that we look at difference. So when we're looking at those things that annoy us, let's analyze it in an objective way, and then see if we can't get to the root cause that's triggering us. And hopefully that will help. And whether that is with my roommate or the culture that we're experiencing, but just through having that conversation is where a lot of that growth can come out, and adjusting to that and being more comfortable with it. There is one element to this that we often talk about, and that's we want our students to learn how to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And recognize this is part of the experience. You're going abroad, and I want you to be uncomfortable because that's part of it. But you have to learn how to deal with that. And so these conversations can help. So I often recommend an activity like hot buttons be done pre-departure. So you're here in the safe environment, low stress. Let's talk about all the stressful stuff before it happens, right? What are the things that are going to trigger you? How are you going to deal with it when it comes up? And to the question about group harmony, I also like, if you can do this with your students, you can come up with some creative strategies, like a safe word, right? If your roommate is doing that thing that really annoys you, cantaloupe, I said cantaloupe, everybody has to stop what they're doing, right? That can also become kind of, make some humor out of the situation and kind of ease tensions that way. And that can also be like a group thing. And like, you'll hear your students wandering around Rome saying cantaloupe at random times. And that identifies them as a group. And that can also contribute to group harmony in kind of weird, funny ways. So there's a lot of different ways you can use this activity and the experience to help students process those things that make them uncomfortable. So I hope that helps, Scott. Okay, I'm not going to let you guys off the hook. You're in the fishbowl. This is one last thing. I need somebody to pick one of these remaining 5 and lead the discussion. Someone fall on their sword.
I would maybe do something then, like how does this relate to the real world? So maybe, and I know we've talked, Dan, you've said like, this is something that you can have students write, they can, verbally. Is it appropriate to have students almost like reenact a situation, a scenario, to have them almost practice it out? Because I think sometimes like we can talk about it and we can say it, but almost if you had them do like a simulation and walk through a scenario where someone's hot button was being pushed, and then you could maybe like debrief as a group, like, okay, what was the hot button that was pushed? Why do you think that happened? Because then I could think like, okay, how does this relate to the real world? Well, then what were the strategies, techniques that they used there to kind of, have empathy, come out of that moment? And then, okay, how can we apply this to a real world situation? So let's imagine we're, here and we're doing this. What do you think some potential hot buttons might be? How could we address them? How could we handle them? I don't know. I'm thinking something like that.
Yeah, and I want to add to Rachel that maybe that could be an authentic way to assess the situation per se, and then go back to what do you learn about this? Okay, we reenacted the situation. How did you feel while it was happening? Do the debriefing, and then okay, what do you learn, and how would this situation change you, or how would you adapt in the future if you have the same situation? I don't know.
Oh no, that's a great idea with assessment. Just kind of like a really good formative one as you're going, just to see if they're grasping, one, their self-awareness, and 2, are they starting to pick up on empathy? But yeah, I think again, maybe having them actually walk through a scenario and then, theorizing, how could we actually apply this in the real world, either when we're traveling or when we get back, either what you learned or the skills that you want to develop and have, how could we bring that back home with us or while we're traveling?
Thank you, Rachel and Carolina. Thank you for that. So we're going to get more with more of these in the workshops, with the activities, giving people an opportunity to lead the discussion. So thank you to both of you for taking over that part. Just trying to keep my mouth shut, even though I wanted to say some stuff. But I do want you all to have some experience with some debriefing questions and being able to ask your students these kinds of questions and lead that conversation, because the worksheet is just the first part. And even if you consider that part 1 and the small group discussions part 2, the debrief is how we're going to really unpack things for the students and help them understand what the takeaways are and how this is useful to the experiences that they're having. So looking at it from an instructor's perspective, I've kind of already gone over some possible uses of this with your students. Practical administrative considerations. So it's a worksheet, so that's pretty straightforward, whether you want to give it to them digitally or on Brightspace or by email, or print it out and hand it out to them if you're doing an in-person pre-departure meeting. Those things are pretty straightforward. But considering your scenario where you're having them act it out, this goes with the next question. What are maybe some challenges, things to prepare for, or to consider in doing that? If you wanted to have them do a role play or act out a scenario, what might be some challenges or problems that could come up?
my God, well, you never know sometimes what a student's going to do. So it's kind of being ready for the unexpected. I think my biggest kind of fear or worry would be that someone could really be triggered. You know, you're doing it as a simulation, but that through actions or words, someone could really be triggered, and you could really, I don't want to say upset someone, but something could be said that could really bring out some negative emotions. And again, I think you could try to spin it to make it a learning opportunity, but you know, you don't ever want to put a student at risk or, you know, expose them to any mental or physical harm, of course. But that would be my fear, is that something, while it's a simulation, something could potentially happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. So some prep work ahead of starting that simulation, like, okay, let's lay the ground rules, kind of like what we do in our workshop of here's the expectations, invitations and permissions. So establishing how we want to interact, and also choosing the topics, right? Is some topics are easier to do a simulation that's a little more lighthearted and not so intense as some very other, you know, some other hot button issues might trigger some very strong reactions. And so maybe being giving some extra consideration to which things you have them kind of play out might be considered. Thank you.
I was thinking about the similar thing, like preparation before. But for example, I am planning Vail, the virtual event within another country. So we have a representative from both country, both universities. So myself and the counter university's professor. So I was thinking, we both meet first, think about like cultural challenges might involve between these two countries, and we discuss this in front, and then before our official meeting with our students, we do kind of pre-meeting, prepare meeting with our own student, telling them this action or your reaction would affect other countries' people, because that has different meaning. For example, I'm not doing this with India, but I learned that when Indian people, if they make this head like this, that means they are really understanding you. When they shake their head like that, they're understanding you. They are focusing on your talk, and this means that they are really into your speaking. But in our culture, Korea culture, when we do this, that means no. So this simple thing, if we tell our student in front, then they can understand the other students' reaction, what it means, and also they can respond to the same body language when they are in this Zoom or online meeting platform. So like small thing, but I think we can let our student know in advance to the event so that they can be culturally, emotionally prepared for the reaction from the other countries.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nori.
You're muted, Dan.
Of course, I clicked on the wrong thing. Thank you, Nori, for sharing that, and thank you for engagement. I want to be mindful of the time. I'm already at 7 after, and I do have a few other things to talk about. Thank you, everyone in the fishbowl, for participating in this. It was a great discussion. And, you know, we're going to have more of these discussions and have some more opportunities to do the TIV debrief practice as well. So I do want to get to some of these different assessment tools. So everyone else you can turn your videos back on now. But I'm going to move on with the slides here to get into the next part of this. So my general questions, I'm going to skim through some of these. Would anybody like to share if you've done more than one intercultural assessment tool? And if you have, what were they?
So I've done the IDI, and then just recently with you, I was introduced to the asks. Okay.
So thank you, Brett. What would you say was the advantages for each of those? What was the kind of the pros for the IDI and the pros for the asks?
Okay, I'm not going to be able to answer that. I don't have that like
That's
right
okay.
in front of me. Just if I recall there being a significant amount of overlap. So I don't recall anything, I mean, quite honestly, that struck me as being that I was unfamiliar with from. So with the IDI, I remember we have the skills, verbal, nonverbal language, and then we
Well,
have.
that would be the AAC&U rubric. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so then what I'm recalling then is then there were also the knowledge, the self-knowledge, and then familiarity with whatever the target culture form, other culture. And then there were the attitudes as well. So, am I confusing the IDI and the asks with another rubric, or?
Well, I think if we're talking about the asks and, you know, the attitude, skills, and knowledge short scale, that was based on the AAC&U rubric. And since that was the one that you did recently, what were some things that you liked about that you know, that worked really well or made it easier compared to maybe some other assessment tools? Was there anything that you felt was kind of a strength of that assessment?
Okay, the one thing that occurred to me, and this is just in light of the fact that I'm going to be doing a 2-week, very brief program, is that, which means that I'm going to want to focus on just maybe a couple things. And so I'm thinking in particular, the attitudes I think would be easy to implement within that short, they'd be very doable within that short time. But it seems to me that these other components kind of piggyback or come along for the ride, as it were, especially, or even the other way around. You start with the knowledge, like you begin introducing, here's historical context for the particular city or museum or whatever the case may be of the things you're going to see firsthand. And that, to the extent that sparks people's interest, already that opens the door to talking about curiosity and the value of that, you know, being open to something new for the first time. So I guess maybe the way in which the strength of that would they seem to interlock pretty
Right.
nicely.
Yeah, definitely. So the rubric itself, having those competencies, there's a lot of, as you put it, interlocking or intersection with each of those competencies. And the ASK assessment, the nice thing about that is it's targeting those specific competencies and measuring each one. And so you can look at each score separately, even of how they're ranking themselves. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the different things we'll need to consider when we're selecting an assessment tools. So first off, the different ways that assessments can be used. So and this came up in the module, assessment of learning. That's the one that's most commonly used for summative assessment. So we're teaching them this content, and then we give them a test at the end. Do they understand the content? So that's what the summative assessment is. Assessment for learning, or formative assessment. This is what I often recommend with the asks too, is it's a great way. You have them take the asks survey. It's relatively short, it's relatively quick, and then they can look at their own responses, and that can become kind of the gateway to, okay, now let's look at where these questions come from. This is based on the AAC&U rubric, and that allows you kind of to introduce this new content. So it's assessment that leads to learning. So they've done the assessment. Now we can look at the rubric and better understand each of these competency areas. And then there's assessment as learning. So in the process of assessing, they are learning stuff. And that can be done through qualitative kind of reflection prompts, where as they're writing out their responses, they're gaining more self-awareness. That's an example of assessment as learning. And there's different approaches. So the holistic approach is you're measuring a lot of different things. So you might be assessing the collective impact of doing worldview frameworks and curiosity, but you might be using an assessment like the IDI that is a much more kind of holistic measurement of intercultural mindsets, as opposed to the asks 2, which has 2 questions about self-awareness, 4 about self-awareness, two about curiosity, two about openness, and so on. Those are component approaches where you're measuring specific components of a framework. There are direct versus indirect measures. So the direct is where you're again, if you were using the qualitative approach, where you're having students write out a response to something, a short essay, you might go in and directly look at what are my students saying and how can I align that with, the rubric of, okay, this statement is a statement about their openness towards engaging with other cultures. And then where does this statement kind of fit in the different proficiency levels of that openness? So that can be a direct measure, but you could have an indirect measure, again, like the IDI, that's getting at a much broader intercultural mindsets that might be impacted through some of these different exercises on specific competencies. Quantitative, that would be any of those assessments that give you numbers. So the asks, you can get numbers. The IDI definitely gives you a score that places the student on the continuum. So if you have a pre-assessment score and a post-assessment score, you can compare the two numbers and see how much growth is there. And again, qualitative, if you're looking at essays, you can still kind of quantify those according to proficiency levels and see if those qualitative artifacts from the students are showing growth as well. High versus low face validity, this has to do with how easily can the test taker figure out what they're being tested on, right? So is the question very transparent that rank your openness on a scale of 1 to 5? Okay, I know I'm being asked about openness, versus something that's asking me about behaviors around openness that's much more low face validity, and I may not just right off the bat know what this is asking me about, but I'm responding to the situation. So there's different ways to think about how to use assessments. Of course, for everyone in IPG, everyone will need to do some kind of summative assessment, because that's part of reporting back at the end when we submit the completion report. We need to look at summative assessment data, analyze it, and then give our take on what we're seeing. So when we're trying to consider different assessment tools, there are different criteria that we can examine for all assessments have to varying degrees. So the first thing is, what is the medium of the assessment? Is it a paper assessment that I need to print out and physically hand out to them? Or is it something that can be delivered online? Or is it something that's only available online? And we have to have access to that in order to do the assessment. The next thing is the length. Assessment fatigue is a very real phenomenon. Our students do get assessed a lot. And specifically with something like the IDI, if you're an engineering student or a polytech student, or even in the College of Ag now, you might experience the IDI multiple times through your 4 or 5 years that you're working on your bachelor's degree. And by the third time you're seeing the same test, you might be thinking to yourself, oh, I got to do this again. So length can play a role. Can they do this really quick and it'll just be a blip and it won't affect them really, especially if I need to do it multiple times, as in a pre and a post. Again, face validity. Do I want something that is more of a low face validity because I don't want them to know what they're being assessed on? Or do I want it to be high? It's really a focus of this course. I want them to be aware of what they're being measured on. The big one that everyone needs to consider is there a cost associated with this assessment tool? The IDI costs $13 a pop for each student. So if you're doing a pre and a post, that's $26 for each student. Do I have access to assessment funding to help pay for this? Or do I need to do a rate request with my study abroad to pass on that cost to my students? Or do I just want to look for something that's free or lower cost? Does it require a debrief? So there are some of these that no, you can just assess them and give them their results or a copy of their responses, and that's it. Some assessments come with an automated kind of breakdown of what the results mean, and that can just be passed on to the students. They can read it on their own. But something like the IDI, it's a little bit more complex. It requires a conversation, right? IDI is typically an individual debrief is about an hour. So those are things to consider. And likewise, the training that goes along with that. With the IDI, you have to go through, I think it's 3 half days of training online. And that cost, when I did it, was $1,600. So are you going to go through that training? Or are you going to find someone? Is there someone available who has gone through that training? Those are things to consider, because with the IDI, you have to have a qualified administrator order the assessments so that you can then distribute them to your students. QA has to be the one to go retrieve the results and then provide either an individual debrief or a group debrief. All of these things need to kind of be considered and planned out ahead of time. And of course, what is it measuring? You know, I think Brett did a really good job illustrating those specific things. So like the ASK measures a lot of different things. So that might be really useful, but it also, even though it measures all 6 competency areas, I can actually hone in on just this one because this is my learning outcome and compare it to the others as well. So this is just, you might be surprised to know this is a short list of criteria to examine when trying to figure out which assessment tool to look at. Different data that can come up. This was a qualitative analysis. So some essays that were given to students, some essay prompts that they responded to. The first group was in 2016 and they got no additional intercultural training at all. They just responded to the essay question. And then their statements were analyzed for curiosity, self-awareness, and openness, and looking for a level 3 proficiency level. And these are the percentages they got. But the following year, they gave them some intercultural instruction, and they saw a dramatic increase in the amount of statements that were at this level 3 or above in these 3 areas. So that's one way to look at qualitative data. The bevy provides a whole lot of very small kind of component measurements that can be looked at, and they use deciles, what percentage of students are demonstrating these at different levels on a 100-point scale. So you have different kind of categories with individual components within them. So very, very detailed, but this one requires a group debrief. You can't give individual debriefs. It's only looking at the group. But even though it does have breakdowns for what percentage of the students are falling into these areas. And so that can be looked at as a pre and a post as well, comparing these scores in a specific area. This was a study I did on our study abroad groups. We had a control group that went abroad for a semester, got no intercultural intervention, and they took a pre-post IDI. And comparing those two, there was a whole lot in stasis. That means they were in this plus minus 7 points. There was no meaningful change between their pre and post. A little bit had at least 1 stage of development, and very, very little had 2 stages of development. And then the blue, this is regression. How many of them regressed 1 whole stage or 2 whole stages? But in one group, we had one-on-one individual mentoring and intercultural competence. And we saw 1, 2, and even 3 and 4 stages of growth. And then with a group where you had multiple students in a group with 1 mentor, we still saw some of that, albeit slightly less in these areas. So that's another way to look at data pre-post to analyze it. So finally, using a rubric for qualitative, I mentioned this at the start, you can have an essay and target one of these competency areas and just comb through a student response and only look for example, worldview. Okay, this is a worldview statement. This is a worldview statement. And then go back and try to figure out, okay, this one is maybe at a level 2. This one's maybe a level 1. And you can do that as a pre-post. You can also do it descriptively of, I'm just going to read through it and see if any of these pop up. And I'll mark all of them as they pop up. And you might have more of an emphasis on self-awareness and less of an emphasis in empathy. So that's another way that you can use rubrics to assess student artifacts or writing. Any questions on this stuff so far? I'm speeding through this just because I want to get to everything before we run out of time. Okay, so lots of things to consider when picking out assessments. I also want to briefly introduce, and because we haven't had a chance to do this yet, if I can get my internet to work. Trying to get my browser to come up here. Here we go. It's hiding behind everything. We've not had a chance to look at the Hubicle. So this is hubicl.org. I've shared this with each of you in our initial meetings. I mentioned it a couple times. You don't have to, thanks, Gabriel. Gabriel had to take off on it. You don't have to have an account to access the website, but because everybody in IPG is going to be contributing with our tool reviews, all of us will need to register an account, and you can actually go to hubicl.org/register to do that. But there's also, you can go over to the side and find where you can log in. But the part I want to focus on today is the digital toolbox. So under Discover, in the digital toolbox, I can go and filter and look for assessments. And I can even filter it even further to specific competencies that I want to look at. So now I've got a slightly shorter list here, and I can go through these and examine some of those criteria. Like, does it have a cost associated with it? So this one does not, no external costs, right? Takes about 30 minutes to do the assessment. Here are my learning objectives. So I know it touches on openness. There's some links here to downloads. So this actually has a lesson plan with it. So how to use this assessment. Links to probably the original sources, but maybe also some other resources that go along with it. Materials is usually like, do you need to have a pen and paper available for your students? In this case, you need to have a copy of the rubric to give to a peer reviewer. Notes is if someone has used this before and they have some useful information they might want to pass on. It's kind of similar to a review, but this is more of from our side of posting this up for everyone to use. We're trying to include as much information as we can. Related tools, this may also be helpful if you're trying to think about how you can use this assessment with specific activities. So getting to that next part. And then of course, it does have reviews available that provide some additional information in here. And then finally, theoretical frameworks. What is this touching upon? So self-awareness, openness, communication, empathy within the AAC&U rubric. But it's also good for people, regardless of any of the stages in the IDI that they might be in. So very flexible in that regard. But there's also some other areas that you can look at. This is especially good for teamwork. So those are some things that you can find when you're looking in the hub for different tools. There's different ways that you can narrow the focus. And of course, I can go in here and look for activities as well, experiential activities, or just other resources as well. So I wanted to take a minute to share that with everyone. We'll look at it again, definitely when we get to the activities portion. So, final thoughts on selecting appropriate assessments. Does anybody have questions about thinking about, we talked last time about learning outcomes, what we want our students to focus on, whether it's worldview frameworks or openness, and thinking about using the Hubicle to find an appropriate assessment. But also those criteria. Is anybody particularly concerned with if an assessment has a cost associated with it?
Hi. Yeah, I'm kind of worried with the cost of an assessment. So I believe that first I would filter and see the ones that are free of charge for my program. But I do believe that maybe for a longer program, mine is also 2-week long only. So maybe I would say because it's so short, I would try to focus on a free of charge. But maybe for a longer program, I don't know if there are other options that you have to pay, but are more valuable. I don't know.
Yeah. So a lot of times, back to my earlier question about advantages and disadvantages of assessments, certainly having one be free is an advantage, but there might also be disadvantages of the ones that have a cost associated with them. Those are proprietary assessments that are often, they've gone through a lot of research and validation studies. And that's part of the reason why they have costs associated with it. They're trying to recoup some of their costs in creating it. But having a lot of validated, so the IDI is highly validated. It's been used for years and tons of research. So if that was a consideration, having a highly credible assessment tool might actually be an advantage, even though it has the disadvantages of a cost associated with it. So thank you, Carolina, for bringing that up. But yeah, if you have money or you don't, that's a fact you got to deal with. Other concerns?
On so my question is on one of the questions I saw on there, Dan, is the when to administer the assessment. Would that vary depending on the type of the program or?
Yeah, it definitely can. So the general rule when we think about a pre-post assessment of what we're trying to measure is what's the impact of my curriculum, my program that I've created for my students? Is it affecting the growth or the learning that I want it to? So we give the pre before anything starts, before the first activity, before the first meeting even sometimes, because we want to have that kind of blank slate measurement of this is where they are before I do anything with them. So that timing needs to be considered. And of course, if my program hasn't started yet or my course hasn't started yet, how do I get this assessment to those students before I've even met with them? That might be the first contact of sending them an email. And by the way, here's an assessment you need to do as part of this program. And then the timing of at the end of the program, if I'm leading a study abroad, do I want them to take the assessment on the plane ride home because I've still got a captive audience? Or do I want to give them some time to kind of process the whole experience and wait a week after they've returned home and they've decompressed and they've had a moment to reflect on their experiences? And maybe that's going to give me better, more accurate results. But then that challenge of, are they going to scatter to the four winds and I'll never get them to take that post test because they've all disappeared on me? Those are considerations. But with the IDI, that's the traditional model, right? The traditional pre, the traditional post. But with something like the asks, that presents some problems with the asks is asking them to self-assess on some of those high face validity questions, but they don't know anything about it when it's a pre-test. So you get very inaccurate results. So for those, we recommend the post and a retrospective pre, where they're taking it, both of them at the end of the program. So that's the timing component. Both of the assessments are at the end, but they do a post. And then the other one is they have to think back to who they were before the program started. And so they're assessing their previous past selves, but the timing of it is actually both of those at the end of the program. So those are things that might need to be considered, both in practical aspects of, can I get them to take this assessment and fill it out, but also aspects of the assessment itself. What works better to get better, more accurate results? Okay, I do want to say, no, we are at the end of the session time. Reminder for everyone to go back to the post-workshop reflection in this module 3. And then if you have some time, explore some of those resources. There are actually some recordings up there from our assessment expert, Catherine Ingby, where she's explaining some of the pros and cons of some specific assessments. So if there's one you're interested in, there might be a video for that. And then, of course, start working on the next module. And I will see you guys in the next workshop. As usual, I'll hang out for a few minutes if anybody has some additional questions. Thank you all for the extra time.
Thank you.
Bye.